The champagne glass slipped from his fingers in slow motion, crystal shattering against marble as Marcus Chen stood paralyzed on the upper deck of the Mediterranean Star. His eyes locked onto a woman he never expected to see again, flanked by two children who carried his face like a mirror reflecting back 7 years of secrets. The twins turned simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized, and when their dark eyes met his across the crowded deck, Marcus felt the carefully constructed walls of his empire begin to crumble. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen had never been the type of man who questioned his decisions. At 35, he commanded a technology empire worth $3 billion, owned properties on 4 continents, and had been featured on the cover of Forbes 3 times in the past 2 years. His mornings began at 4:30 with a punishing workout routine, followed by conference calls with Tokyo, London, and São Paulo before most people had their first cup of coffee. His life operated with the precision of Swiss clockwork, every minute accounted for, every interaction calculated for maximum efficiency. The Mediterranean cruise had been his sister's idea, or more accurately, her insistence. Victoria Chen rarely asked her older brother for anything, but when she did, Marcus found it nearly impossible to refuse. She had called him 6 weeks earlier, her voice carrying that particular edge of concern that only siblings could master, informing him that she was getting married aboard the Mediterranean Star during its 2-week voyage from Barcelona to Athens. Family attendance was mandatory, not optional, and she wouldn't accept any excuses about quarterly reports or board meetings. Marcus had tried every argument in his considerable arsenal. He had investor presentations scheduled. The Singapore office was in the middle of a critical product launch. His presence was essential for negotiations with a German pharmaceutical company. Victoria had listened patiently to each excuse before delivering her ultimatum with surgical precision. Either he attended her wedding and spent 2 full weeks disconnected from work, or she would show up at his next shareholders' meeting and tell everyone about the time he got drunk at her college graduation and serenaded her roommate with an off-key rendition of a pop song. The threat was juvenile but effective. Marcus valued his carefully cultivated image of control and sophistication far too much to risk that particular story becoming public knowledge. So here he was, standing on the polished teak deck of a luxury cruise ship, wearing linen pants and a silk shirt that felt absurdly casual compared to his usual tailored suits, watching the Spanish coastline disappear into the golden haze of late afternoon. The Mediterranean Star was exactly the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that Marcus normally avoided. The ship accommodated only 200 passengers, ensuring an intimate atmosphere that came with a price tag that would make most people's eyes water. Every surface gleamed with understated luxury, from the hand-carved wooden railings to the crystal chandeliers that sparkled in the main dining room. Staff members outnumbered guests almost 2 to 1, appearing and disappearing with the efficiency of well-trained phantoms, anticipating needs before they were articulated. Victoria had spared no expense for her wedding voyage. She had reserved the entire upper deck for the ceremony itself, scheduled for the final evening before the ship docked in Athens. Until then, the passengers would enjoy what the brochure cheerfully described as an immersive Mediterranean experience, with stops in Monaco, the Italian Riviera, Sicily, and several Greek islands. For Marcus, it represented 2 weeks of enforced idleness, separated from his email, his team, and the comforting rhythm of constant productivity. He had spent the first 6 hours aboard trying to find adequate internet access, only to discover that the ship's connection was deliberately limited. Passengers could send brief messages, but extended video conferences or large file transfers were essentially impossible. Marcus had actually felt his chest tighten with something approaching panic when he realized he wouldn't be able to attend the daily morning briefings with his executive team. His assistant, Jennifer, had promised to handle everything in his absence, but the thought of being truly unreachable for 2 weeks felt like voluntarily stepping into a sensory deprivation tank. The welcome reception was held on the promenade deck at sunset, with champagne served in delicate flutes and small plates of Mediterranean appetizers circulating among the guests. Marcus had positioned himself near the railing, nursing his drink and mentally composing emails he couldn't send, when Victoria appeared at his elbow looking radiant in a white sundress that caught the evening breeze. "You're doing that thing again," she said, her voice affectionate but exasperated. "What thing?" "The thing where you're physically present but mentally reviewing spreadsheets. I can literally see you calculating something behind your eyes." Marcus forced himself to smile and take a sip of champagne. "I'm here, aren't I? 2 whole weeks of vacation. You should be proud. I'll be proud when I see you actually relax." "When was the last time you took a real break, Marcus? Not a weekend where you work from home, but an actual vacation where you didn't think about business?" He started to answer, then realized he couldn't remember. 3 years ago, maybe 4, there had been a ski trip to Switzerland, but he'd spent most of it on conference calls from the lodge. Before that, a weekend in the Maldives that had been cut short by a crisis with their manufacturing partner in Taiwan. "Exactly," Victoria said, reading his silence correctly. "You're going to enjoy these 2 weeks, even if it kills you. Doctor's orders. You're not a doctor. You teach literature at a university. Same principle. I diagnose your problem as acute workaholic syndrome, and I prescribe 2 weeks of mandatory fun." Marcus was about to respond with something appropriately sarcastic when Victoria's fiancé appeared, a marine biologist named Thomas who had somehow managed to convince Marcus's notoriously particular sister to marry him. Thomas was the opposite of everything Marcus valued in his own life. He was spontaneous where Marcus was planned, relaxed where Marcus was driven, content with a modest research salary where Marcus measured success in quarterly growth percentages. Yet watching them together, Marcus couldn't deny that his sister seemed genuinely happy in a way he wasn't sure he'd ever experienced. The reception continued as the sun melted into the Mediterranean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful if Marcus had been capable of appreciating them. He made appropriate conversation with other passengers, most of whom seemed to be either friends of Victoria and Thomas or wealthy retirees with more money than sense. Everyone wanted to know what he did for a living, and he'd perfected the art of describing his work in vague enough terms to avoid lengthy follow-up questions. "Technology consulting," he would say, which was technically accurate but left out the part about running a company with offices in 12 countries and a valuation that had tripled in the past 18 months. He was on his second glass of champagne, listening to an elderly woman from Connecticut describe her grandchildren's various accomplishments, when he noticed the staff setting up additional tables near the far end of the deck. More passengers were apparently joining the voyage at their first port stop in Monaco the following morning. The Mediterranean Star allowed passengers to board at multiple ports, though Marcus couldn't imagine why anyone would choose to join a cruise already in progress rather than experiencing the full journey from the beginning. The evening wound down around 10, with guests drifting back to their cabins in small clusters. Marcus's suite was on the panorama deck, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows, a private balcony, and furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. He'd barely glanced at the amenities when he first arrived, immediately setting up his laptop and attempting to tether his phone for better internet access. Now, standing on the balcony with the sound of waves against the hull and the night air cooling his skin, he found himself wondering what he was supposed to do with all this enforced leisure time. Sleep came reluctantly, his mind racing through everything that might be going wrong in his absence. His chief technology officer was competent, but he had a tendency to be too conservative with innovation timelines. His chief financial officer was brilliant with numbers, but sometimes missed the broader strategic picture. His vice president of operations was excellent at execution, but needed guidance on prioritization. Marcus had built his company by being involved in every significant decision, and the thought of 2 weeks without that level of control felt like asking him to breathe underwater. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with aggressive Mediterranean sunshine pouring through the windows. Marcus woke at his usual time, discovered there was no gym adequate for his normal workout routine, and settled for a punishing run on the ship's small track that required him to complete 40 laps to equal his usual 5 miles. By the time he finished, soaked with sweat and only marginally less anxious, the ship was already approaching Monaco. The principality rose from the coast like something from a fairy tale, its buildings climbing the hillside in tiers of white and terracotta, the famous casino district glittering even in morning light. The Mediterranean Star docked with practiced efficiency, and crew members began organizing shore excursions for passengers who wanted to explore. Marcus had no interest in tourist activities. He found a quiet corner of the upper deck, opened his laptop, and managed to download several emails before the ship's limited bandwidth crawled to an unusable speed. He was typing a response to his CFO about the quarterly projections when he heard the commotion near the gangway. New passengers were boarding, their luggage being efficiently whisked away by porters while they completed check-in procedures. Marcus barely glanced up, too focused on trying to articulate his concerns about their revenue forecasts and the 3-sentence limit he'd imposed on himself to conserve bandwidth. Then he heard a laugh that made his fingers freeze on the keyboard. It was a sound he hadn't heard in 7 years, but his body recognized it before his conscious mind caught up. His head snapped up, eyes searching the crowd of new arrivals, and that's when he saw her. Isabel Santos stood at the top of the gangway, her dark hair longer than he remembered, pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the elegant line of her neck. She wore white linen pants and a blue top that matched her eyes, sunglasses pushed up on her head, laughing at something someone had said. She looked exactly the same and completely different, as if the 7 years had both touched and not touched her. She was thinner, maybe, or perhaps it was just that his memory had softened her features, made her less real and more idealized over time. Marcus felt something cold spread through his chest, a combination of shock and something else he didn't want to name. Isabel, here, on this ship. It was impossible, yet there she was, as solid and real as the deck beneath his feet. He started to stand, some instinct driving him toward her, when 2 children appeared beside her. They were perhaps 6 years old, a boy and a girl, and they moved with the unconscious synchronization of twins who had shared space since before birth. The girl had Isabel's dark hair, but the boy's was lighter, almost brown. They both wore matching white outfits, clearly chosen for travel, and they stood close to their mother with the casual confidence of children who knew they were loved. Marcus sat back down, his legs suddenly uncertain. Twins. Isabel had children. Of course she did. 7 years was a long time. She would have moved on, built a life, found someone who could give her the family she'd always wanted. The thought shouldn't have bothered him. He'd been the one to end things, the one who'd made it clear that children didn't fit into his carefully planned future. She'd simply taken him at his word and found happiness elsewhere. He was about to close his laptop and retreat to his cabin, already mentally recalculating how he might avoid Isabel for the next 2 weeks, when the boy turned around. The child's face was lifted toward the sky, mouth open in wonder at something above, probably a seagull or the ship's towering smokestacks. His profile was perfectly clear in the morning sunlight, and Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. The boy had his nose, not similar, not reminiscent of, the exact same slightly crooked line that Marcus had inherited from his father, the result of a soccer ball to the face when he was 12 that had healed at a slight angle despite the best efforts of an excellent plastic surgeon. It was a distinctive feature, unusual enough that people sometimes asked if it had been broken. Marcus's hands began to shake. He looked at the girl, who had turned to say something to her brother, and saw the same shape to her jawline that he saw every morning in the mirror. The same widow's peak at her hairline. The same way her eyebrows arched when she was concentrating. The champagne glass slipped from his fingers in slow motion, crystal shattering against marble as Marcus stood paralyzed on the upper deck. His eyes locked onto Isabel, who hadn't noticed him yet, still focused on getting her children situated with the efficiency of a mother who'd done this dance countless times before. The twins turned simultaneously, their movements perfectly synchronized, drawn by the sound of breaking glass. When their dark eyes met his across the crowded deck, Marcus felt the carefully constructed walls of his empire begin to crumble. They had his eyes, Not Isabel's lighter blue-gray, but his own dark brown, so deep they appeared almost black in certain light. The girl's gaze was direct and curious, assessing him with an intensity that was unnervingly familiar. The boy's expression was more reserved, analytical, his head tilting slightly to one side in a gesture Marcus had been told he did constantly when processing new information. Isabel followed her children's gaze, and her face went through a series of expressions so rapid Marcus almost missed them. Shock, followed by something that might have been fear, then a carefully neutral mask that didn't quite hide the tension in her shoulders. She placed a protective hand on each child's head, a gesture so instinctive it was clearly automatic. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the 20 feet of polished deck. 7 years of silence and unanswered questions hung in the space between them, heavy enough to feel like a physical presence. Marcus opened his mouth, though he had no idea what he intended to say. What would he possibly say? The standard social pleasantries seemed absurdly inadequate. A crew member appeared with a broom to sweep up the broken glass, breaking the spell. Isabel bent down to whisper something to the twins, then straightened and began walking toward the interior of the ship, clearly intending to find their cabin and escape this confrontation. The children followed obediently, though the girl kept glancing back over her shoulder, her curiosity apparently stronger than her mother's desire to flee. Marcus found himself moving without conscious decision, following them at a discreet distance. His mind was racing, trying to calculate timelines and possibilities. 7 years ago, they'd been together. 7 years ago, she'd told him she was ready for the next step, ready to talk about marriage and family and building a life together. 7 years ago, he told her that his company was at a critical growth phase and he couldn't afford the distraction. That children would have to wait, maybe indefinitely. That she should find someone who could give her what she wanted because he wasn't that person. She cried. He remembered that clearly now, though he tried not to think about it in the years since. She'd cried and asked if he was sure if this was really what he wanted, if there was any chance he might change his mind. He'd been kind but firm, explaining that he cared about her, but knew himself well enough to understand that he would never be the family man she deserved. Better to be honest now than waste more of her time. She'd left his apartment that night, and he'd thrown himself into work with even more intensity than usual. Within 3 months, he'd closed the deal that had transformed his mid-sized software company into a genuine tech industry player. Within 6 months, he'd forgotten entire days of his life because he was working 18-hour stretches. Within a year, he'd convinced himself that ending things with Isabel had been the right decision, perhaps the only mature decision he'd ever made in a relationship. But if those children were his, if those twins with his face and his eyes were actually his biological children, then everything he'd told himself for 7 years was built on a foundation of ignorance. Isabel and the twins disappeared into the corridor leading to the mid-level cabins. Marcus followed, staying far enough back to avoid seeming like he was stalking them, close enough to see which cabin they entered. He watched her slide a key card into the lock of cabin 247, usher the children inside, and close the door with a decisive click that sounded final even from a distance. He stood in the corridor for several minutes, staring at that closed door. A rational person would walk away. A rational person would recognize that 7 years of separation meant Isabel owed him nothing, certainly not an explanation about her personal life. A rational person would understand that those children might not be his at all, that facial similarities could be coincidental, that jumping to conclusions based on a glimpse across a deck was the height of foolishness. Marcus had built his fortune on being rational, on making decisions based on data rather than emotion. But standing in that corridor, staring at cabin 247, he felt anything but rational. He raised his hand to knock, then lowered it again. What would he even say? His mind, usually so quick with perfect phrasing for any business situation, was completely blank. Hi, Isabel, haven't seen you in 7 years. By the way, are those my children? The absurdity of it made him want to laugh or possibly break something. A cabin door opened further down the corridor, and an elderly couple emerged, nodding politely at Marcus as they passed. He realized he looked suspicious, lurking in the hallway like some kind of creep. He forced himself to walk back toward the upper deck, his mind spinning with questions that had no immediate answers. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Marcus tried to focus on the emails that had managed to download during the brief window of adequate bandwidth. But his concentration was completely shattered. His sister found him around lunch, took one look at his face, and immediately demanded to know what was wrong. "Nothing," he said, the lie transparent even to himself. Victoria crossed her arms and fixed him with a look that had convinced him to confess to breaking their mother's favorite vase when he was 10. "Try again. I saw someone I used to know. Someone from before." "Before what?" "Before everything. Before the company took off. Before I became this." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the expensive watch on his wrist and the designer clothes and the entire persona he'd constructed over the past 7 years. Victoria's expression softened. "A woman?" Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to say more. "And you didn't part on good terms?" "We parted on honest terms." "I thought that was the same thing." His sister sat down beside him on the deck chair, her wedding planning temporarily forgotten. "Do you want to talk about it?" He did, and he didn't. The words felt trapped in his chest, too large and complicated to fit through the normal channels of speech. But this was Victoria, who'd known him before success and money had transformed him into Marcus Chen, technology mogul. This was his sister, who'd once held his hand during their parents' funeral and promised him they'd get through it together. Her name was Isabel, he said finally. "We were together for 2 years. She wanted marriage and kids. I wanted to build the company. I ended things because I thought it was fair to let her find someone who could give her what she needed. And now she's on the ship with twins, 6-year-olds, a boy and a girl." Victoria's eyes widened as she did the mental math. "Marcus, are they? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. They look like me, Victoria. Really look like me. Same nose, same eyes, same expressions." His sister was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same careful consideration she brought to everything. "Did she see you?" "Yes." "And what did she do?" "Took the kids and disappeared into her cabin." "Can you blame her? If you're the father, that means she's been raising them alone for 6 years. Seeing you unexpectedly probably felt like having a bomb go off in her carefully managed life." Marcus hadn't thought about it from that perspective. He'd been so caught up in his own shock, his own questions, that he hadn't considered what this encounter might mean for Isabel. If the twins were his, she'd built an entire life around that secret. She'd been pregnant and alone, made the decision to keep the children without telling him, raised them through infancy and toddlerhood and all the challenges of early childhood without any support from their father. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. If those children were his, then Isabel had gone through pregnancy alone, had experienced labor and delivery alone, had spent sleepless nights and dealt with illnesses and celebrated first words and first steps alone, all while he was closing deals and accumulating wealth and congratulating himself on his clarity of purpose. "I need to talk to her," he said. "Obviously, but maybe give her some time to process. Seeing you was probably a shock. We're on a ship, Victoria. There's limited space and 2 weeks of voyage time. Running into each other again is inevitable. Then let it happen naturally. Don't ambush her. Let her come to you when she's ready. What if she's never ready?" His sister shrugged. "Then you'll have to make a decision about whether to force the conversation or respect her silence." "But Marcus, if those children are yours, you can't just walk away again. You know that, right?" He didn't know that. Despite every instinct that told him to protect the careful equilibrium of his life, despite every calculation that suggested children would complicate his business operations, despite everything he'd built his identity around for the past 7 years, he knew he couldn't simply ignore this situation. The afternoon dragged into evening. Marcus skipped dinner, unable to face the prospect of socializing while his mind was trapped in an endless loop of questions. He stood on his private balcony as the ship pulled away from Monaco, watching the lights of the Principality fade into the distance. Somewhere on this vessel, Isabel was probably doing the same thing, watching the coastline disappear while her children slept in the next room. Their children, possibly, probably. He tried to remember the last time he'd seen her before that final night. They'd gone to dinner at a small Italian restaurant she loved, one that didn't care about his growing reputation or the fact that his company's valuation was being discussed in industry publications. The owner had known her by name, had brought her favorite wine without asking. She'd been telling him about a project at the nonprofit where she worked, something about expanding their after-school programs into underserved neighborhoods. Her eyes had been bright with passion for the work, and he found himself calculating whether he could make a substantial donation without it seeming like he was trying to solve her problems with money. Looking back now, he could see the signs he'd missed. She'd been quieter than usual, more thoughtful. She'd ordered his favorite dessert to share, even though she usually preferred something else. She'd reached across the table to hold his hand, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that had felt both familiar and weighted with meaning he hadn't understood at the time. She'd been preparing to have the conversation, the one about their future, about taking the next step, about whether what they had was going somewhere or simply treading water. And he'd responded by ending things with all the emotional intelligence of a corporate merger. Marcus poured himself a scotch from the cabin's well-stocked bar, then set it down without drinking. Alcohol wouldn't help. Nothing would help except getting answers to the questions that were slowly driving him insane. He pulled out his laptop again, opening a blank document, and started to type out questions he needed to ask. Are the twins mine? Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant? How have you managed on your own? Do they know about me? What are their names? That last question stopped him cold. He didn't even know their names. If those children were his, he'd missed 6 years of their lives. He didn't know their favorite colors or their fears or what made them laugh. He didn't know if they were good students or struggled in school. He didn't know their birthdays, for God's sake. He didn't know anything except that they had his face, and they existed, and they were on this ship. Sleep was impossible. Marcus lay in the expensive sheets of his luxury cabin, staring at the ceiling and listening to the gentle creak and sway of the ship. Somewhere nearby, in cabin 247, Isabel was probably doing the same thing. Lying awake, wondering how this situation would resolve, planning what she would say when the inevitable conversation finally happened. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening in gradual degrees from black to deep blue to the pale pink of early morning. Marcus gave up on sleep around 5, showered, and dressed in casual clothes that felt uncomfortable in their informality. He'd spent 7 years in suits and business attire, armor against a world that might see weakness if he appeared too relaxed. The ship's dining room opened at 6 for early risers. Marcus headed there, hoping coffee and the distraction of breakfast might settle his mind. The room was nearly empty, just a few other passengers and the ever-present staff moving efficiently between tables. He chose a spot by the window, ordered coffee and something he didn't really want to eat, and tried to focus on the morning light reflecting off the water. He heard them before he saw them. Children's voices, high and clear, asking their mother if they could have pancakes. Marcus's entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing in preparation for a confrontation he still didn't know how to handle. Isabel entered the dining room with a twin on each side, the three of them forming a tight unit that spoke of long practice at navigating the world together. She saw him immediately, her step faltering for just a moment before she straightened her shoulders and continued to a table at the opposite end of the room. The twins hadn't noticed him yet, too busy debating the merits of chocolate chip pancakes versus blueberry. Marcus watched them with an intensity that probably appeared creepy to anyone paying attention. The boy gestured animatedly while he talked, his hands cutting through the air in emphatic movements that Marcus recognized from his own presentation style. The girl listened with patient attention, occasionally interjecting with questions that seemed designed to test her brother's logic. They were smart. He could tell that just from watching them interact. Quick, analytical, confident in their opinions while still being open to discussion. They had good manners without seeming oppressed by them, saying please and thank you to the server without their mother having to prompt them. Marcus realized he was gripping his coffee cup hard enough to hurt his fingers. He forced himself to relax, to breathe normally, to not look like a stalker watching someone else's family. Except they might not be someone else's family. They might be his family, a concept so foreign to his carefully ordered life that he almost couldn't process it. The girl said something that made her brother laugh, a sound so pure and unguarded that it pierced straight through all of Marcus's defenses. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? When was the last time he'd experienced joy that wasn't tied to a successful deal or a positive quarterly report? Isabel glanced in his direction, and their eyes met across the dining room. The look she gave him was complicated, layered with emotions he couldn't fully parse. There was wariness, certainly, maybe anger, though it seemed muted by time and distance. But there was also something else, something that looked almost like sadness, as if she grieved for what they'd lost or never had. Marcus nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that they needed to talk, that this couldn't be avoided. Isabel looked away first, turning her attention back to her children, and Marcus understood that she wasn't ready. Not yet. She needed time to fortify herself, to decide what she wanted to say and how much she was willing to reveal. He finished his coffee without tasting it, left the dining room while Isabel and the twins were still eating their pancakes, and headed back to his cabin. The day stretched ahead with no structure, no meetings to attend, no decisions to make except the impossible ones about how to handle this situation. Victoria found him an hour later, having apparently decided that checking on her brother was more important than wedding planning. She took one look at him and immediately raided his minibar, pouring 2 generous glasses of whiskey despite the early hour. "Drink this," she ordered. "It's 9 in the morning. I don't care. You look like you're having an existential crisis, and I prescribe alcohol." Marcus took the glass, but didn't drink. "I saw them again. At breakfast. And they're definitely mine, Victoria. I don't need a DNA test. I just know. What are you going to do?" "I have no idea. She won't talk to me. She's avoiding me, which is her right, but we're on a ship. We can't avoid each other forever." Victoria settled into the chair across from him, swirling her whiskey thoughtfully. "Let me ask you something. What do you want to happen here? Ideally, in whatever fantasy world you imagine, what would be the outcome?" Marcus was silent, because he genuinely didn't know. A week ago, his life had been clear and uncomplicated. He ran his company, he accumulated wealth, he measured success in concrete terms that could be graphed and analyzed. Children had never been part of that equation, not because he disliked them, but because they represented chaos and unpredictability and commitments he couldn't quantify. But those twins in the dining room, those children with his face and his mannerisms, had detonated something in his chest that he didn't know how to contain. "I want to know them," he said finally. "I want to understand who they are. I want them to know I exist." And Isabel? That was more complicated. His feelings about Isabel were tangled with guilt and regret and the ghost of what they'd once had. He'd loved her once, or at least he'd felt something powerful enough to approximate love. He'd ended things because he'd been stupid and short-sighted and convinced that his company was more important than anything else. "I don't know," he admitted. "I hurt her badly. I don't have any right to expect forgiveness or a second chance. But you want it anyway? Maybe. Yes. I don't know. This is impossible, Victoria." His sister smiled, not unkindly. "Welcome to being human, Marcus. It's messy and complicated and impossible to control. Kind of the opposite of everything you've built your life around." She was right, of course. Marcus had constructed his entire existence around certainty and control, around being able to predict outcomes and manage variables. Children didn't fit into that framework. Relationships didn't fit into that framework. Messy, complicated feelings about a woman he'd walked away from 7 years ago definitely didn't fit into that framework. But here he was anyway, thrown completely off balance by a chance encounter on a cruise ship, and for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Chen had absolutely no idea what his next move should be. The ship docked in Portofino on the 3rd day, and Marcus watched from his balcony as passengers disembarked for organized excursions into the colorful Italian village. He'd signed up for nothing, content to remain aboard and maintain his vigil, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was waiting for. Isabel and the twins had left early, part of a group heading to explore the local markets and historic churches. He'd seen them from a distance, the children wearing matching sun hats and holding their mother's hands as they descended the gangway. The rational part of his brain insisted he should use this time productively. He could finally make those calls to his office without interruption. He could review the financial projections that Jennifer had managed to send in compressed files. He could maintain some semblance of the control that had defined his life for so long. Instead, he found himself wandering the nearly empty ship like a ghost, unable to settle anywhere, his thoughts constantly circling back to cabin 247 and the secrets it contained. Victoria found him in the library, an elegant room lined with leather-bound books that probably nobody ever read. She dropped into the chair beside him with an exasperated sigh that reminded him of their teenage years when she'd been perpetually frustrated by his intensity. "You're being pathetic," she announced without preamble. "Sitting here, moping while she's out there living her life. This isn't like you, Marcus. You're a man who makes billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. Why can't you just talk to her?" "Because she doesn't want to talk to me," he replied, staring at a book he'd been pretending to read for the past hour. "Every time I get within 20 feet, she finds a reason to be somewhere else. So corner her. Be direct. You're good at that in business. Why not in your personal life?" "Because in business, I have leverage. I have something people want. Here, I have nothing. I'm just the man who walked away from her 7 years ago, and now I'm asking for something I have no right to ask for." Victoria leaned forward, her expression serious in a way that meant she was about to say something he probably needed to hear. "Let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who brought her children on a luxury cruise she probably couldn't easily afford. I see twins who are well-dressed, well-mannered, and clearly loved. I see someone who's built a good life despite whatever happened between you two. That takes strength, Marcus. That takes resilience. Maybe instead of thinking about what you've lost, you should think about what she managed to create without you." The words stung because they were true. Whatever else Isabel had done, she'd raised those children well. He'd seen enough in those brief glimpses to recognize confidence and curiosity and kindness. Those qualities didn't appear by accident. They were cultivated through patient attention and genuine care. What if she tells me to leave her alone? What if she says the twins aren't mine, even if we both know they are? What if she's built a life that doesn't have room for me in it? Then you respect that, Victoria said firmly. But you don't know any of that until you actually have a conversation. Right now, you're creating stories in your head based on assumptions and fear. His sister left him with that observation, heading back to finalize details with the ship's event coordinator for the wedding ceremony. Marcus remained in the library, turning her words over in his mind. She was right about the stories. He'd always been good at constructing narratives that justified his choices, that made his decisions seem inevitable rather than chosen. He'd told himself for 7 years that ending things with Isabel had been the mature choice, the responsible choice, the only choice that made sense given his priorities. Now he wondered if he'd simply been a coward, afraid of vulnerability and connection and all the messy emotions that came with genuine intimacy. The passengers returned from Portofino as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, their arms full of shopping bags and their conversations animated with stories of gelato and harbor views. Marcus positioned himself strategically near the gangway, determined to intercept Isabel before she could disappear into her cabin again. He felt ridiculous, like a teenager working up courage to approach his crush, but he also felt certain that if he didn't act now, he might spend the entire 2 weeks in this state of suspended anxiety. He saw the twins first, racing ahead of the adults in their group, their earlier restraint apparently abandoned in the freedom of a day ashore. The boy carried a small toy boat, clearly purchased from one of the village shops, and was explaining something about its construction to his sister with earnest enthusiasm. The girl listened with patient attention, asking questions that seemed designed to draw out more details rather than challenge his expertise. Isabel followed several paces behind, carrying a canvas bag that bulged with souvenirs and looking more relaxed than Marcus had seen her since boarding. The Mediterranean sun had brought color to her cheeks, and she was laughing at something another passenger had said. For a moment, Marcus could see the woman he'd known 7 years ago, the one who'd found joy in simple pleasures and hadn't yet learned to guard her heart against disappointment. Then she saw him standing by the gangway, and her expression shifted into something more wary. She said something quick to the twins, who immediately moved closer to her sides, their bodies forming that protective triangle that spoke of practiced routine. Marcus felt a pang at the gesture, at the clear message that he was perceived as a threat to their carefully maintained unit. He stepped forward before he could lose his nerve, blocking their path to the interior corridors in a way that was impossible to ignore without being obviously rude. "Isabel," he said, keeping his voice low and controlled. "We need to talk." She met his eyes steadily, and he saw steel there that he didn't remember. The Isabel he'd known had been soft in her responses, quick to accommodate, almost too understanding of his demanding schedule and constant prioritization of work. This Isabel looked like someone who'd learned to set boundaries and defend them. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not in front of them." The twins were watching this exchange with open curiosity. The girl tugged on her mother's hand. "Who is that man, Mama? Why is he talking to you?" "Just someone I used to know, sweetie. An old friend." Friend felt like a knife between his ribs, reducing everything they'd shared to casual acquaintance. But Marcus understood the necessity of it. Whatever conversation they needed to have couldn't happen with two 6-year-olds as audience. "Tomorrow," he said, "when we dock in Cinque Terre, there's a cafe near the harbor. I'll wait there at 10. Isabel hesitated, and he could see her calculating whether avoidance was still possible or if confrontation had become inevitable. Finally, she nodded once, a short, sharp movement that conveyed reluctant agreement rather than enthusiasm. "Fine. 10 o'clock. But just you and me. No ambushes, no lawyers, no drama." "Agreed." She moved past him, shepherding the twins toward the interior of the ship with a mother's practiced efficiency. The boy glanced back once, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten. Did he sense something? Did some instinct tell him this stranger was more than just an old friend of his mother's? Marcus spent the rest of the evening in a state of anxious preparation. He drafted mental scripts for the conversation, anticipating questions and formulating responses with the same rigor he brought to business negotiations. But this wasn't negotiation, not really. This was something far more complex and unpredictable. Dinner that night was a formal affair, with Victoria and Thomas hosting their wedding party at the captain's table. Marcus sat through courses of Mediterranean cuisine, making appropriate conversation while his mind was entirely elsewhere. He caught glimpses of Isabel across the dining room, seated with other passengers, the twins apparently in the ship's childcare program for the evening. She looked beautiful in a simple navy dress, her hair down around her shoulders, and Marcus found himself remembering the first time he'd seen her at a charity fundraiser where she'd been coordinating volunteers. She'd been wearing red that night, he remembered suddenly. A simple dress that probably hadn't cost much, but had looked perfect on her. She'd been organizing name tags and welcome packets with cheerful efficiency, making every donor feel personally welcomed despite the chaos of 100 people arriving simultaneously. He'd been there reluctantly, fulfilling a social obligation that his publicist insisted was important for his company's image. He'd planned to make a brief appearance, write a check, and leave within the hour. Instead, he'd spent 3 hours talking to the woman with the red dress and the infectious laugh, forgetting completely about the emails waiting in his inbox and the presentation he'd planned to refine that evening. She'd been so passionate about the nonprofit's work, so genuinely invested in making a difference rather than just appearing charitable. When he'd asked for her number at the end of the night, she'd hesitated, clearly unsure if his interest was genuine or if he was just another wealthy man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He'd spent 2 weeks proving his sincerity, sending thoughtful messages rather than expensive gifts, learning about her interests rather than trying to impress her with his accomplishments. Their first real date had been to a small Vietnamese restaurant she loved, nowhere impressive or Instagram-worthy, just good food and better conversation. He'd found himself telling her things he rarely shared, talking about his parents' death and the pressure of building something meaningful from their legacy. She'd listened without judgment, asked questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. For 2 years, Isabel had been the one part of his life that felt uncomplicated. She'd never demanded more time than he could give. She'd never resented his work hours or his constant travel. She'd built her own life around him rather than expecting him to reshape his around her. Looking back now, Marcus realized he'd mistaken her patience for contentment, her adaptability for lack of needs. He'd convinced himself that their arrangement worked because she'd never complained, never pushed, never asked him to choose between her and his ambitions. Until she had. Until that final night when she gently but firmly told him that 2 years was long enough to know if a relationship had a future, and she needed to understand what their future looked like. She'd been so careful in her phrasing, so conscious of not appearing demanding or unreasonable. She made it clear she wasn't issuing an ultimatum, just seeking clarity. And he'd responded by ending things entirely, convinced he was being honest rather than simply afraid. The dinner finally ended near midnight, with guests drifting toward the upper deck for after-dinner drinks and dancing. Marcus excused himself, claiming exhaustion, and retreated to his cabin. Sleep proved as elusive as the previous nights, his mind running through potential conversations until the words lost all meaning. Morning arrived with overcast skies that matched his mood. The ship docked in Vernazza, one of the 5 villages that comprise Cinque Terre, its pastel buildings climbing the steep hillside like a colorful cascade. Marcus was at the designated cafe by 9:30, ordering espresso he didn't drink and watching the harbor fill with tourists and locals beginning their daily routines. Isabel arrived exactly at 10, punctual as always. She dressed simply in jeans and a white linen shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression guarded but composed. She sat across from him without preamble, declining the waiter's offer of coffee or pastries. "You want to talk," she said. "So talk." Marcus had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that the moment had arrived, all his careful preparation evaporated. He found himself staring at her, noting the small changes that 7 years had wrought. Fine lines around her eyes, a certain weariness in her posture that hadn't been there before, a guardedness in her expression that felt like armor against potential hurt. "Are they mine?" he asked, abandoning all pretense of building up to the question gradually. Isabel didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." The confirmation hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd known, even though every instinct had told him the truth from that first glimpse across the deck. Hearing her say it made it undeniably real. "Why didn't you tell me?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Are you seriously asking me that? You made it abundantly clear that children didn't fit into your 5-year plan. You ended our relationship because I wanted to talk about a future that included family. What exactly was I supposed to say? Surprise, I'm pregnant. I know you specifically told me you never wanted kids, but here we are." "I had a right to know," Marcus said, hearing the defensive edge in his own voice. "You had a right to know if you'd been someone who wanted to be involved," Isabel replied, her calm more devastating than anger would have been. "But you weren't that person. You were very clear about your priorities, and I respected them. I made the choice to keep the pregnancy and raise the children myself, and I stand by that decision. You made a unilateral choice that affected my life, too." "No, Marcus. You made a unilateral choice when you ended our relationship rather than have an adult conversation about what a future together might look like. You don't get to be upset about not being consulted when you made it clear you didn't want to be part of that conversation in the first place." He wanted to argue, to find some logical flaw in her reasoning, but the truth was she was right. He'd closed the door on their relationship decisively, framing it as a kindness, but really protecting himself from the vulnerability that commitment required. "Tell me about them," he said, changing tactics. "Tell me about the twins." Isabel's expression softened slightly at the mention of her children. "Their names are Sophie and Daniel. They're 6 years old, obviously. They're in 1st grade at a bilingual school near where we live. Sophie wants to be a marine biologist. Daniel thinks he wants to be an architect, but changes his mind weekly. They're smart, curious, kind to each other most of the time. They love reading and swimming and building elaborate constructions out of whatever materials they can find." Marcus absorbed these details hungrily, filing them away like precious data. "Do they know about me? Do they know they have a father?" "They know they have a father," Isabel said carefully. "They know he wasn't able to be part of their lives. I've tried to be honest without being harsh, to answer their questions without making you into a villain or a hero. Just a person who made choices based on what he wanted at the time. What have you told them about why I wasn't there? That you had other priorities. That sometimes adults make decisions that seem right in the moment, but have lasting consequences. That their existence isn't a mistake or a burden, even if the circumstances of their conception weren't planned. Marcus felt guilt settle over him like a heavy blanket. How did you manage? Financially, logistically, all of it? Isabel shrugged. The same way anyone manages when they don't have other options. I worked as long as I could during the pregnancy, saved everything I could. My mother helped for the first year, took care of the twins while I worked. I got a better job with a nonprofit that had decent benefits. I learned to budget carefully, to prioritize needs over wants, to accept help when it was offered. We're not wealthy, but we're doing fine. The cafe was filling with mid-morning customers, tourists consulting maps, and locals greeting each other with familiar affection. Around them, life continued in its normal rhythms, oblivious to the 7 years of history being excavated at this small corner table. I want to be part of their lives, Marcus said. I know I have no right to ask, and I know you've done an incredible job without me. But I'm asking anyway. I want to know them. I want them to know me. Isabel studied him with an expression he couldn't read. Why? Why now, after 7 years? Is it guilt? Is it some midlife crisis realization that your company isn't enough? Maybe all of that, he admitted. Or maybe seeing them activated something I didn't know existed. Maybe I'm selfish enough to want what I explicitly rejected years ago. I don't have good answers, Isabel. I just know that walking away again feels impossible. They sat in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the harbor washing over them. A fishing boat pulled into dock, its crew calling to each other in rapid Italian. Children somewhere nearby shrieked with laughter. The smell of fresh focaccia drifted from a nearby bakery. This isn't a business negotiation, Isabel said finally. You can't just decide you want to be involved and expect me to hand over access to my children. Our children, yes, but children I've protected and nurtured and built a life around for 6 years. If you want to be part of their world, you need to understand that it's not about your schedule or your convenience. It's about what's best for Sophie and Daniel. I understand that. Do you? Because being a parent isn't something you can fit in between board meetings. It's not a project you can delegate when it gets inconvenient. It's showing up consistently, reliably, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. I know my track record doesn't inspire confidence, Marcus said, but I'm capable of change. I'm capable of learning to prioritize differently. Are you? Or do you just think you are because you're in the emotional grip of a shocking discovery? What happens in a month when a novelty wears off? What happens when they're sick or struggling in school or going through difficult phases? What happens when being a father interferes with a crucial business deal? Those were fair questions, and Marcus didn't have answers that wouldn't sound like empty promises. How could he prove his commitment when he had no track record to point to? How could he demonstrate that this wasn't just a temporary emotional reaction, but a genuine willingness to reshape his life? Let me start small, he said. Let me spend time with them on this cruise. No pressure, no forced bonding, just opportunities for them to get used to my presence. You can supervise every interaction. You can end any meeting whenever you feel it's not working. Just give me a chance to show you that I'm serious. Isabel looked out at the harbor, her profile revealing the internal debate playing out behind her careful expression. Marcus waited, resisting the urge to argue his case further. He'd made his request. Now the decision was hers, as it should be. Supervised visits, she said finally. Short at first. And if I see any sign that this is hurting them or confusing them or making their lives more complicated, we're done. Your rights, as a biological father, don't supersede their rights to stability and emotional security. Agreed. Completely agreed. And Marcus, one more thing. If you start this, you finish it. You don't get to decide halfway through that it's too hard or too time-consuming and just disappear. Because they will get attached, especially Sophie. She's been asking questions about her father for 2 years now, wondering why she doesn't have what her friends have. If you're going to be in their lives, you're committing to being in their lives for the long term. Not just for this cruise, not just until work gets busy again. For real. The weight of her words settled over him, the full magnitude of what he was asking to take on. This wasn't a business venture he could exit if the metrics didn't meet expectations. This was a permanent, irrevocable commitment to two small humans who had every right to expect consistency and love and presence. "I understand," he said, "and I'm committed. To whatever comes, whatever it requires. I'm committed." Isabel nodded slowly, though skepticism still lingered in her eyes. "We're scheduled to be back on the ship by 3. Meet us at the pool deck at 4. We usually swim in the late afternoon. You can join us there. Make it seem casual and natural rather than some formal introduction." "Thank you," Marcus said, meaning it more deeply than those simple words could convey. "Thank you for giving me this chance. Don't thank me yet. Earn it." She stood to leave, and Marcus found himself wanting to say more, to articulate things he didn't have words for. But she was already walking away, moving back toward the village shops where the twins were probably exploring with supervision from the ship's childcare staff. He watched her go, this woman who had carried and raised his children alone, and felt the full weight of what he'd missed and what he still stood to lose if he couldn't prove himself worthy of inclusion in their carefully built world. The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Marcus returned to the ship and attempted to distract himself with work, but concentration proved impossible. He changed clothes 3 times, unsure what one wore to casually encounter their previously unknown children at a pool. Business casual seemed absurd. Full resort where felt like trying too hard. He finally settled on simple swim trunks and a white t-shirt, then spent 20 minutes second-guessing that choice. Victoria appeared at his cabin door at 3:30, taking one look at his face and immediately understanding what was happening. "You're meeting them," she said, "in 30 minutes. At the pool. I'm terrified." "Good. You should be. This is terrifying. But you'll be fine. What if they hate me? What if they sense something is off and reject me immediately?" His sister sat on the edge of his bed, her expression gentle. "Marcus, they're 6 years old. They're not going to hate you. They might be shy or curious or completely uninterested. But kids are remarkably resilient and adaptable. Just be genuine. Don't try to buy their affection or impress them. Just be present and kind and let them set the pace. I don't know how to talk to children. Then listen more than you talk. Ask them questions about things they care about. Show genuine interest in their answers. You're good at that in business meetings. It's the same skill set, just applied to a different context." At 3:55, Marcus made his way to the pool deck with the careful deliberation of someone approaching an execution. The area was moderately crowded with passengers enjoying the afternoon sun. He spotted Isabel immediately, settled on a lounge chair with a book open on her lap, but clearly not reading. The twins were in the pool, engaged in some elaborate game that involved diving for coins and keeping score with a system only they understood. Marcus stood at a distance, uncertain how to announce his presence. Should he approach Isabel first? Call out to the children? Simply stand there until someone noticed him? The decision was made for him when Daniel surfaced from an underwater expedition, spotted Marcus, and immediately called out to his mother. "Mama, that man from yesterday is here. The friend you used to know." Isabel set down her book and gestured for Marcus to approach. He crossed the deck with legs that felt unsteady, hyper-aware that this moment would define everything that followed. "Sophie and Daniel," she said as the twins climbed out of the pool, dripping water onto the warm deck. "This is Marcus Chen. He's an old friend, and he's going to join us this afternoon." Sophie studied him with open curiosity, her dark eyes assessing him with an intensity that felt unnervingly familiar. "You're very tall," she observed. "I am," Marcus agreed, unsure what else to say. "Do you know how to swim?" "I do. Do you want to play our game? We're diving for treasure. Daniel is winning, but only because he cheats." "I do not cheat," Daniel protested. "You're just bad at holding your breath." Marcus glanced at Isabel, who nodded permission. He pulled off his shirt, feeling oddly self-conscious, and followed the twins back into the pool. The water was perfect, warm enough to be comfortable, but cool enough to be refreshing. Sophie immediately explained the elaborate rules of their treasure game. speaking rapidly and with absolute confidence that he would keep up with her logic. For the next hour, Marcus dove for coins, adjudicated disputes about whose turn it was, and learned that 6-year-olds had boundless energy and zero concept of personal space. Daniel climbed on his back without hesitation, demanding to be launched across the pool like a projectile. Sophie insisted on teaching him a complicated handshake she'd invented, making him repeat it until he got it exactly right. They asked questions with the directness that only children could manage. What do you do for work? Why are you on this ship? Do you have kids? That last one made Marcus's breath catch, but he managed to say simply that he was still figuring out that part of his life. Through it all, Isabel watched from her lounge chair, her expression unreadable behind sunglasses. Marcus was acutely aware of her surveillance, understanding that every interaction was being evaluated, every response measured against some internal standard she developed for protecting her children. When the twins finally grew tired, climbing out of the pool with pruned fingers and exhausted contentment, Marcus felt as drained as if he'd run a marathon. Socializing with children required a different kind of energy than business negotiations, a constant attention and engagement that left no room for mental multitasking. "You're fun," Sophie announced, as if delivering a verdict after careful deliberation. "Will you come swimming with us again tomorrow?" Marcus looked at Isabel, seeking permission. She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "If your mother says it's okay, I'd like that." "It's okay," Daniel said confidently. "Mama likes you. I can tell because she keeps watching you with her special face." "What special face is that?" Isabel asked, amusement breaking through her careful neutrality. "The one where you're pretending not to care, but you actually do. You use it when you're watching Sophie at soccer and pretending you're not nervous." Isabel's cheeks flushed slightly, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest. She was watching him, evaluating him, but maybe with more than just maternal protection. Maybe with some echo of what they'd once meant to each other. The twins ran off to collect their towels, leaving Marcus and Isabel in a bubble of temporary privacy. "Thank you," he said, "for this afternoon, for trusting me with them." "I didn't do it for you," she replied. "I did it for them. They deserve to have answers to their questions, even if those answers are complicated. They're incredible, Isabel. You've done an amazing job with them." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "They're the best thing I've ever done. The hardest thing, but the best thing. I'm sorry I wasn't there." The words came out before he could stop them, raw and unplanned. Isabel looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something in her expression soften just slightly. "I was angry for a long time," she said quietly. "Angry that you got to make a choice, and I didn't. Angry that you were building your empire while I was learning to function on 3 hours of sleep. Angry that they would grow up with half their heritage unknown. But anger doesn't serve anyone, especially not children. So I chose to let it go and focus on building the best life I could for them. You could have contacted me at any point. You could have demanded support, financial or otherwise. I could have, but I didn't want them growing up with a father who was there out of obligation rather than genuine desire. I didn't want to force you into a role you'd explicitly rejected. And honestly, Marcus, part of me wanted to prove I could do it myself. That I didn't need your money or your name to build a good life." The twins returned, wrapped in towels and arguing about whether they should have pasta or pizza for dinner. Marcus watched them debate with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating international policy, and found himself marveling that he'd helped create these small, opinionated, completely fascinating humans. As they gathered their belongings to leave, Sophie reached out and took Marcus's hand with casual trust that made his throat tight. "Will you eat dinner with us?" she asked. "Mama said we could eat at the special restaurant tonight if we finish our vegetables at lunch, and we did, so we can, and you should come." Marcus looked at Isabel, who shrugged in a gesture of surrender. "Apparently you're invited to dinner," she said. 7 o'clock. The Italian restaurant on the starboard side. And yes, before you ask, you need to wear something nicer than swim trunks. That evening, as Marcus dressed for dinner with more care than he'd brought to million-dollar presentations, he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. His face carried an expression he couldn't quite name, something softer than his usual calculated confidence, something that looked almost like hope. He'd spent 7 years building an empire, measuring his worth in acquisitions and market share and quarterly growth. And in a single afternoon with 2 6-year-olds who had his eyes and his stubborn insistence on following rules to absurd conclusions, he discovered that all his accumulated success felt hollow compared to the weight of Sophie's small hand trusting his. The transformation had begun, though Marcus didn't fully realize it yet. The walls he'd built around his heart weren't crumbling dramatically, but rather developing small cracks, hairline fissures that would eventually grow into openings large enough to let love and chaos and all the messy complications of family finally pour in. The call came on the 9th day of the cruise, just as the ship approached Santorini. Marcus was having breakfast with Sophie and Daniel, listening to them debate whether white buildings or blue domes were more architecturally significant, when his phone vibrated with an emergency alert from his office. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. The Singapore deal was collapsing. 3 months of negotiations, hundreds of hours of preparation, and his absence had apparently created enough uncertainty that their partners were threatening to walk away. Jennifer's message was brief but urgent. They need you on a video call in 2 hours. If you're not there, we lose everything. Marcus stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull of obligation and responsibility. This deal represented 18 months of strategic planning. It would open entire new markets for his company. The financial implications were staggering. His entire executive team was counting on him to close this, and he was on a cruise ship in the Mediterranean playing father to children he'd only known for a week. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked, her perceptiveness cutting through his distraction. "Just work stuff, sweetie. Nothing for you to worry about." But Daniel was watching him with those analytical eyes that were so unsettlingly familiar. "Are you going to leave?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus looked at this small boy who barely knew him, who had no reason to trust him, and saw the beginning of disappointment forming behind his careful expression. How many times had Daniel asked that question about other adults who drifted in and out of his life? How many times had promises been broken by people who claimed to care but disappeared when something more important came along? "No," Marcus said, making the decision even as the word left his mouth. "I'm not leaving." He typed a response to Jennifer with shaking hands. "Handle it without me. You have full authority to make whatever decisions are necessary. I trust your judgment." The reply came back within seconds. "Marcus, this is a billion-dollar deal. You can't just not show up. Watch me." He typed, then silenced his phone completely. Isabel had been watching this exchange from across the table, her expression unreadable. Later, after the twins ran off to their morning art class, she cornered him on the observation deck. "You just walked away from something important," she said. "I saw your face when you got that message. Whatever it was, it mattered." "Not as much as this matters," Marcus replied, gesturing toward where Sophie and Daniel had disappeared. "Not as much as showing them that I mean what I say when I promise to be here. That's a very expensive lesson in follow-through. Some lessons are worth the cost." Isabel studied him for a long moment, and he saw something shift in her expression. The guardedness that had defined their every interaction since boarding began to crack, revealing something softer underneath. "You're really trying, aren't you? This isn't just guilt or obligation or some midlife revelation. You genuinely want this." "I do. More than I've ever wanted anything, and I've spent my adult life wanting things very intensely." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her familiar perfume, close enough to remember how perfectly she used to fit against him. "What happens when we get off this ship, Marcus? When we return to real life and you have to balance being a father with running your company. When the novelty wears off and it's just the hard, boring, repetitive work of showing up every day. Then I'll figure it out," he said. "I'll restructure my schedule. I'll delegate more. I'll move to wherever you and the twins live if that's what it takes. I'll do whatever is necessary because the alternative is unacceptable." "And what about us?" She asked the question so quietly he almost missed it. "What about what we were before all of this?" Marcus reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I hurt you badly. I know that. I ended something beautiful because I was afraid and stupid and convinced that my company was the only thing that mattered. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect a second chance. But if you're asking whether I still have feelings for you, whether seeing you again reminded me of everything I walked away from, the answer is yes. I spent 2 years being angry at you, Isabel said. 2 years resenting you every time I was exhausted or overwhelmed or scared. 2 years telling myself I was better off without someone who could walk away so easily. And then I spent the next 5 years trying to forget you completely, building a life that didn't include you even as a memory. And now you're here being good with my children, making sacrifices I never thought you were capable of, and I don't know what to feel. Part of me wants to keep every wall firmly in place, because letting you back in means risking getting hurt again. But another part remembers why I loved you in the first place. The words hung between them, acknowledgement of feelings neither had voiced until now. Marcus took her hand, threading his fingers through hers in a gesture that felt both new and achingly familiar. I can't promise I'll be perfect at this, he said. I'll probably mess up regularly. I'll probably struggle with balancing everything. But I can promise that I'll never walk away again. Not from the twins, and not from you if you'll give me another chance. Before Isabel could respond, they heard familiar voices approaching. Sophie and Daniel appeared, their hands covered in paint, arguing about whose interpretation of the Parthenon was more historically accurate. We made pictures for you, Sophie announced, thrusting a colorful paper at Marcus. That's you and me and Daniel and Mama. We're family. Marcus looked at the painting, at the 4 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun, and felt something break open in his chest. The twins had drawn him into their family without hesitation, without requiring proof or promises, simply accepting his presence as natural and right. That evening, as the ship sailed past Santorini's iconic cliffs glowing pink in the sunset, Victoria found Marcus standing alone on the upper deck. Her wedding was scheduled for the following night, the culmination of 2 weeks of celebration, as she looked more peaceful than he'd ever seen her. You did it, she said, standing beside him. You actually changed. I'm trying to change, Marcus corrected. It's an ongoing process. Mom and Dad will be proud, not of the company or the money, of this, of you finally letting yourself be vulnerable enough to connect with people. I wish they were here to meet Sophie and Daniel. They would have spoiled those kids absolutely rotten. Victoria leaned her head on his shoulder. So what happens now? After the cruise ends and reality intrudes? Marcus pulled out his phone, opening the email from Jennifer that had arrived an hour earlier. The Singapore deal had fallen through, exactly as predicted. His board was demanding an emergency meeting. Several major investors were questioning his leadership. The financial press was speculating about instability in his company's management structure. Now I deal with the consequences of my choices, he said, and I accept them, because what I gained is worth more than what I lost. The wedding the next evening was beautiful in its simplicity. Victoria and Thomas exchanged vows on the upper deck as the sun set over the Aegean Sea, surrounded by friends and family who had journeyed from around the world to celebrate with them. Sophie and Daniel served as flower girl and ring bearer, taking their responsibilities with endearing seriousness. Marcus stood with Isabel during the ceremony, their hands intertwined, and watched his sister marry someone who made her genuinely happy. He thought about all the years he'd prioritized achievement over connection, success over satisfaction, and wondered how he'd been so blind to what actually mattered. During the reception, as music played and guests danced under strings of lights, Daniel approached Marcus with unusual solemnity. "Can I ask you something?" The boy said. "Of course, buddy. Anything. Are you going to be her dad? For real, not just for vacation?" Marcus knelt down, so they were eye level, aware that Isabel was watching from nearby. "I want to be your dad very much. But that's a decision your mom needs to make too, and it's something that has to happen gradually. What I can promise is that I'm not going anywhere. Whether we're on this ship or back home, whether it's easy or hard, I'm going to be part of your life if you want me to be." Sophie joined her brother, slipping her hand into Marcus's with the casual trust she'd developed over the past week. "We want you to be our dad," she said. We already decided. We even voted on it. And it was 2-0 with one abstention. One abstention? Mama wouldn't vote. She said she needed more time to think about it. Isabel approached, clearly having overheard this exchange. Kids, why don't you go find some cake? I need to talk to Marcus for a minute. Once the twins were safely occupied with dessert, she turned to face him fully. They drew you as part of the family in every picture they've made this week. They ask about you constantly. They've started calling you our Marcus when they talk to other kids. You've become real to them in a way I honestly didn't expect. Is that a bad thing? It's terrifying, she said honestly. Because if you change your mind, if you decide this is too complicated or too demanding, they're the ones who get hurt. Not me. I've been hurt before and survived. But they're 6 years old, and they don't understand why people leave. I'm not leaving, Marcus said for what felt like the 100th time, but this time with absolute conviction. I know I can't prove that with words. I'll have to prove it with time and consistency and showing up even when it's inconvenient. But Isabel, I swear to you on everything I've built and everything I am not walking away from them. Or from you. She studied his face in the soft glow of the party lights, searching for something he hoped she would find. Then, slowly she smiled. Okay, she said. Okay, let's try this. But we're doing it my way at my pace. You don't get to rush into this just because you're used to making quick decisions in business. This requires patience and consistency and proving yourself over months, not days. I'll take whatever timeline you need. I'll meet whatever requirements you set. Just give me the chance. The cruise ended the next morning in Athens, passengers disembarking with luggage and souvenirs and memories of 2 weeks in the Mediterranean sun. Marcus stood with Isabel and the twins as they prepared to leave the ship, his future suddenly full of questions he couldn't answer with spreadsheets or strategic plans. Where do we go from here? He asked. We start with visits, Isabel said. Regular, scheduled visits where you spend time with Sophie and Daniel. We set up video calls for the weeks when geography makes in-person meetings difficult. We introduce the concept of you being their father gradually, letting them adjust at their own pace. And us? She smiled, reaching up to touch his face gently. We take it slow. We remember that we're not the same people we were 7 years ago. We figure out if what we had can exist in this new reality, or if we need to build something entirely different. Marcus pulled her close, kissing her forehead in a gesture that felt like both a promise and a prayer. I can work with slow. I've spent my career solving complex problems. This is just a different kind of challenge. This isn't a problem to solve, Marcus, she said softly. It's a life to live. There's a difference. Teach me the difference, he said. I'm a quick learner. 6 months later, Marcus sat in a conference room facing his board of directors, presenting the restructured company he'd built in the aftermath of the Singapore deal collapse. He'd promoted key executives into expanded roles, delegated decision-making authority more broadly, and imposed strict boundaries on his own work hours. The changes had been painful and expensive, costing him millions in lost opportunities and alienating some traditional investors who preferred his old management style. But his company was stronger for it, more resilient, less dependent on his constant presence. And more importantly, he was present 3 afternoons a week when Sophie and Daniel finished school, available for video calls every evening before bedtime, and completely unreachable during weekend family time that had become sacred. The board approved his restructuring plan unanimously, though several members expressed concern about his reduced availability. Marcus accepted their feedback with equanimity he never would have managed a year earlier. He learned that not every problem required his personal intervention, that competent people could be trusted with significant responsibility, and that his company's long-term health didn't require him to sacrifice everything else in his life. That evening, he attended Daniel's first school play, watching his son portray a tree with enthusiastic commitment to the role. Sophie sat beside him, whispering commentary about the other students' performances with the confidence of someone who knew she could do better. Isabel held his hand throughout the production, and when it was over and Daniel took his bow with the other trees, Marcus applauded until his hands hurt. Afterward, celebrating with ice cream at their favorite shop near Isabel's apartment, Daniel asked the question he'd been working up courage to voice for weeks. Can we call you Dad now, instead of Marcus? Everyone at school thinks it's weird that we call our father by his first name. Marcus looked at Isabel, who nodded permission. Nothing would make me happier, he said, surprised to find his voice thick with emotion. Sophie climbed into his lap, something she did regularly now, and rested her head against his chest. Good, because I've been calling you Dad in my head for a while now, and it was getting confusing keeping track of what I said out loud. 3 months after that, on a quiet Sunday morning in the apartment that had become as familiar to Marcus as his penthouse, he proposed to Isabel while the twins were occupied with cartoons in the next room. He didn't have a ring prepared, no elaborate romantic gesture planned. He simply looked at the woman who'd given him a second chance he never deserved and asked if she would marry him. "Are you sure?" she asked, tears already forming in her eyes. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want? Because once we do this, there's no going back. We're a package deal, me and the twins, and all the complicated, messy reality of family life." "I've never been more certain of anything," Marcus said. "I spent 7 years being successful and lonely. I'd rather spend the rest of my life being challenged and loved." She said yes while Sophie and Daniel cheered from the doorway where they'd been eavesdropping. The wedding happened 6 months later, small and intimate, with Victoria serving as maid of honor and the twins as ring bearers, who took their responsibilities very seriously. Marcus Chen never regretted the deals he lost, or the money he sacrificed, or the professional reputation he rebuilt from different foundations. Because every evening when he came home to the controlled chaos of family life, when Sophie demanded help with homework and Daniel insisted on explaining his latest architectural theory, when Isabel greeted him with a kiss that still made his heart race, he knew he'd finally discovered what success actually meant. The man who'd once measured his worth in quarterly reports and market valuations now measured it in bedtime stories read and soccer games attended and quiet moments watching his children sleep. He'd built an empire, yes, but he'd learned that the greatest achievement of his life wasn't anything he'd constructed in steel and glass. It was the family he'd almost lost, the love he'd been too blind to see, and the second chance that transformed him from a successful businessman into a man who finally understood what mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.